talk to you this afternoon about a very different type of storytelling that last year affected the lives of about 24,000 kids in the US, most of them disadvantaged kids, many of them from migrant families, and which also late last year started in London. And it was very late, so it's still kind of a few hundred kids, but it's growing. It should be growing very quickly. And it's an idea that my colleague at the Sydney Morning Herald, he also works there, that's why he's not here, and his name's Tim Dick. We want to bring that to Australia for the first time with something called the Sydney Story Factory. So I'll start at the beginning. You may have heard of a novelist called Dave Eggers. He wrote a book called A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, What is the Watch, a couple of others. He's a wonderful writer, and he comes from a family of teachers, and he has a lot of friends who are English teachers. And the one thing that he always heard them saying was that what they wanted to do was give their kids one-on-one help. But they're in public schools, they've got too many kids, they're understaffed, they just do not have the time to do that. So he's a groovy young novelist, he's hanging out in New York and San Francisco, and he looks around at all his friends, he's like, man, my friends have nothing but time. You know, they can all spare a couple of hours once a week, and they all have a love of the written word. So he came up with a very simple idea of putting these two things together, of opening a tutoring centre for kids to give them one-on-one help with their writing that was staffed mainly by volunteers. He was going to open this next to his publishing company. He owns a really great little publishing company called McSweeney's, and it was going to be near that, which was all fine until the landlord said to them just before they opened, look, the problem is it's zoned for retail, so you're going to have to sell something. So they looked at the shop and it had these kind of wooden beams at the top, and it kind of looked a little bit like the inside of a ship. So they opened a pirate supply shop. It sells everything the working buccaneer needs: treasure maps, feed for your parrot, eye patches, you can get black ones for nighttime, something a little jazzier for the day, mermaid bait, other such essentials. And it started off as a kind of, it was just a requirement and a bit of a gag, but actually it became an incredibly important part of the operation, because for the kids to get to the centre, they have to walk through the shop. They have to walk past that mermaid bait. They have to, you know, if they stop and read the sign about pirate practical joking, 12 mop heads fall on their head, you know. So by the time they get to the centre, they know they're not in school. They know they're in a place where their everyday rules do not apply, and they can really let their imaginations run wild. It also, 8 years down the track, makes 20% of the revenue for the shop, which is no small thing either. It was an enormous success, okay? They now have in San Francisco about 1,500 volunteers, and last year they helped 4,000 kids. Most of them are disadvantaged. Most of them come from backgrounds where English is not the first language, a lot of Spanish kids. It's a kind of area, it's in the mission area where there's a sort of mix of, you know, groovy young hipsters and lots of kids who come from really poor backgrounds. It was such a success that they've now opened 7 more centres across the US. They all have the same idea. It's a tutoring centre and a little shop at the front. The shops vary depending on where they are. In New York, which is obviously where all superheroes come from, there's a superhero supply shop. And they have a little capery with a wind machine, so you can try them on and make sure that they'll sort of flow nicely while you're leaping tall buildings in a single bound. In Chicago, they have the Boring Store, which sells everything an undercover secret agent needs, like mobile phones shaped like bananas and stuff like that. Last year, they helped 24,000 kids with nearly 5,000 volunteer tutors in the US. And in November last year, Nick Hornby opened the first one in London. It's called the Ministry of Stories, and it's behind Hoxton Street Monster Supplies. And it sells this. And it also sells this. And it's really, it's a wonderful thing. And one of the things is that when Tim and I started thinking about doing this, we contacted San Francisco. And they put us in touch with a guy called Matt, who worked with Nick Hornby setting up the one in London. He's a graphic designer. He did a lot of work in the shop, a lot of the supply, you know, the design for the supplies like this. And he also did the volunteer work. And that was a really wonderful thing for us, because he told us what it was like to go into these schools and to do these exercises. Because it basically breaks up into 3 categories. They have a centre with an after-school thing. Kids can come in after school, they get one-on-one help with their homework or any kind of writing project they can imagine. If they want to write a film script, they want to do a graphic novel, they want to do a photographic essay, anything they like. And they also do workshops around particular ideas like that. But the main thing, and the really important thing that we want to start doing in Sydney soon, is they go into schools and they are extra bodies in the English class. So they take their cue from teachers. You know, the teachers know these kids better than we do. They know what these kids need better than we do. So they're just there to offer that kind of one-on-one help that a teacher can't provide. Or they also have a series of programs that they've devised and they run. And so Matt did one of these where they get 4 or 5 volunteers, they go into a class of like 6 or 7-year-old kids and they help them write a monster story. And so the first thing you need if you're going to write a monster story is you need a monster. So they help the kids make up the monster. And they do that by going through the different parts of, you know, the anatomy of a monster. And they have to describe it using a simile. So, you know, his eyes are like great balls of fire, you know, and then they go, and what are his ears like? And this particular class that Matt was talking about, there were all these 6 or 7-year-old black kids down there near Hoxton. And one of them went, ooh, his ears, there's like dragon wings, man. You know, and his mate next to him was like, no, they're like snakes, you know. And they really got into it. And they created this monster, all the kids together. And then Matt was down the back of the class and he's drawing the monster, you know, so they can see it. Then when they've got their monster, they start making a story about the monster together, you know. So the monster got up one morning and he wanted to do what? You know, and they start creating this. There's someone else with a computer and a screen and he types the story as they're writing it. And then when they get to a cliffhanger in the story, when they get to the point where the monster stepped out and screamed because he saw all the kids go back to their desks and they finish writing the story themselves. And there's someone else out the back with a computer, and by the time they go home, they get a little book and it's got their name on the front and it's got the picture of the monster inside and it's got the start of the story that they all wrote together, and then it's got blank pages for them to fill in the rest. And I don't know what your English classes were like, but I never did anything like that in mine. And if I had, it would have made a tremendous difference to my enjoyment and experience of school. So what we want to do is bring this idea to Sydney. We want to bring it to Redfern because it's got that, you know, it's similar to the areas where it's worked before. It's got lots of young people who are, you know, interesting and have time and who have a kind of community spirit. It also has huge areas of disadvantaged people, kids in the Waterloo Towers. Because the whole principle, it's based on 2 very simple ideas. It's based on the idea that good writing skills are essential for a successful life. If you cannot express yourself clearly, if you are uncomfortable with reading and writing, it is much, much harder to get ahead. It's also based on the idea that great leaps in learning are made with one-on-one attention. American research has shown that if you spend 35 to 40 hours a year with a kid one-on-one, helping them to read and write, it will, on average, lift the results by an entire grade. So if they're a C, they don't just go to like a C plus or a B minus, they go to a B. It is a big difference. But I think the other thing is that if you're a kid, especially from a migrant background, if you're a young girl and you do not speak English at home, you are probably very unsure and uncertain of how you express yourself. But if you have an adult who sits down with you and just you for an hour and thinks that your thoughts and your ideas are really worthwhile and thinks they're worth putting down, thinks they're worth printing, what we will be doing is taking those stories and using them in all sorts of ways. You know, we'll put them on our website, we'll publish them in zines, we'll do books every year with a foreword by a prominent writer. They're going to be published in the Sydney Morning Herald. It's showing them that what they think and what they imagine really matters. Right, so this is what we want to do. We need quite a lot of money to do that. We don't actually have a concept for that yet because we're journalists and we're not very good at that stuff, but we do have a really great creative agency called the Glue Society who've agreed to do it all for free. They're going to come up with 3 concepts and all the design work, and we're going to pitch those 3 ideas to our volunteers and also to kids. We're going to take it out to kids and, you know, see which one really piques their imagination, which one they really like. We have had the most amazingly generous and enthusiastic response to this project. We only started doing it, I don't know, 8 weeks ago or something. Glue has helped us. Gilbert and Tobin's doing our legal work for free. Every single writer we have approached has agreed to support the project. David Malouf, Kate Grenville, Tom Keneally, Malcolm Knox, Gail Jones, James Bradley, Marcus Zuzak, it just goes on. We put out a very kind of low-key call for volunteers last week, and we've had about 130 people put up their hands so far and say they want to help. We're waiting for a business plan, which is also being done pro bono, and then we're going to start going out to get the money, and we really hope to open in Redfern later this year. Professor Tony Vincent, who's a kind of guru in the area of welfare, put out a very big and important report a couple of years ago called Dropping Off the Edge, where he tried to isolate the causes of disadvantage. It's obviously an extremely complicated thing, and it's very hard to boil it down to any, surefire thing. But the one thing he said at the end of it was that the one clear thing that came out of his report was that if you have poor education as a child, you are statistically much more likely to have a low income, to be unemployed, to have poor health, and to end up in prison. That's just the facts. And one of the reasons that kids often get a poor education is because they're not comfortable with words, because they don't feel there is a place for them in the world of reading and writing. We all know that that's important. We all know that child literacy is important, but it also seems a big and complicated and difficult thing. And I think what something like the Sydney Story Factory does is it takes that great big problem and it shrinks it. It shrinks it to the size of one kid sitting in front of you with his eyes shining and, his mind opening up, putting one word after another on the page. We are hoping to launch this concept at the Sydney Writers' Festival in May. We're going to do a little kind of pop-up shop, so a small version that Glue's doing for us, and then a small tutoring centre at the back. We need an awful lot of things to help us get there. We need people to help with the kids. We need people who can staff a shop. We know people who to run a shop, anything like that. If anyone does want to help, it's very easy. All you have to do is email the Sydney Story Factory at gmail.com, and we can send you out all the information that you need. And I just wanted to end with a quote from Dave Eggers, who founded it, because I think it kind of gets to the heart of the whole thing. He said that some of these kids just plain don't know how good they are, how smart they are, and how much they have to say. You can tell them. You can shine that light on them, one human interaction at a time. So come and join us if you want to, or at least if you're passing by our centre in Redfern later, or if you see us down at the Sydney Writers' Festival, at least pop in and buy some zombie breath mints. Thanks.